Hi writers! Welcome to this presentation on self-revising strategies. My name is Olivia Bedford. I'm a developmental editor, book coach, writer, and educator. I specialize in helping novelists find the magic in their messy manuscripts so they can write the best books possible. It may not come as a surprise, but revision is my absolute favorite part of the writing process. This is when our stories really come alive and become the best they can be. So, I'm incredibly excited to talk about this part of the writing process with you. Let's start with an overview of what we'll cover in this presentation. We'll start with general strategies that you can use at any stage of the revision process. Next, we'll focus on specific strategies for revision and editing. Yep, you heard that right. I am referring to them as separate things. We'll get to why in a minute. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about getting feedback on your work. Yes, getting feedback is essential, even if you plan on doing most of the revision work yourself. My goal for today is to introduce you to different strategies that you can bring into your revision process. However, this presentation is not comprehensive. I'm going to cover the how, but not necessarily talk about what you should be looking for as you revise. Think of this as the beginning of a journey of learning, exploring, and figuring out what works best for you and your books. Don't worry, I am not leaving you on your own. I created a guide to revision resources that can help you navigate every step of the revision and editing process. You'll find that guide at oliviahelpswriters.com/wwc-resources. That is a password-protected page exclusive to attendees of this conference, so you'll need the password REVISE in all caps to access that page. Let's dive in. General strategies for your revisions. Strategy number 1. Enter the revision process with the right mindset. The first draft is all about you as a writer. But when it comes time to revise, you need to focus on this question. Is every choice you make serving the reader? I know different people have different goals for their writing. You might want to be a bestseller. You might just want to share your story with family and friends. It doesn't matter. If you plan to publish your work for other people to enjoy, you need to put that reader front and center and make sure that your story is going to be what they need it to be. That depends on your genre. It depends on your audience, their age level. This is going to be different for every single book and every single writer. That's why it's so important to keep filtering your choices through the lens of the person that you want to serve with your story. In addition to helping you make those technical choices, this is also a great way to keep yourself motivated. Taking your book from first draft to final draft is really hard. There's no way around it. Revision is hard work, especially when you have to make big changes and do multiple rounds. Think about that future reader in Barnes & Noble, surfing Amazon, who finds your book at exactly the right time, falls in love with your characters, and maybe ends up changed by the words that you wrote. Again, your goal does not have to be a world-changing novel. It could just be something that helps someone escape from a bad day at work. But whatever you're doing, focus on the person that you're doing it for, and use that as motivation to keep working through every change and revision that you have to make. Strategy number 2. Separate revision and editing tasks. Like I said at the beginning, I treat revision and editing as two different things. In my mind, revision is macro level. This is where we are focusing on the effectiveness of the story as a whole, addressing elements like plot, structure, character arcs. In contrast, editing is when we focus on all the micro stuff, the paragraph and line level issues like syntax, word choice, descriptions, grammar. I know that many people use these terms interchangeably, and if you look in the dictionary, the definitions are basically the same. The benefit of treating these as two separate steps in the process is to make sure that we revise every element of our novels and aren't skipping over big steps in the process. Too many people think that revision and editing are just the things that happen at the line level. They imagine that they need to go straight to the red pen and start looking for typos and other issues like that. Actually, we need to start with revisions. We need to think about the developmental, story-level stuff first. The reason for that is if you make big changes in your manuscript, all of the editing work that you did before is worthless. Imagine you spend hours polishing up a scene and then realize that it actually doesn't further the main narrative and is actually just boring to all of your beta readers. At best, you've wasted the time that you spent editing. At worst, you might keep that scene in even though it's getting people to close your book and not come back. So, handle the big developmental stuff first. Polishing can come later. Here's an example of what that might look like. You might revise in 4 rounds, starting with structure, plot holes, character arcs, conflict, all that big stuff that is going to play out over the novel as a whole. Then we might go to the scene level stuff, characterization, pacing, world building. Your 3rd round might focus on the quality of your descriptions, your dialogue. Then, in that final round, you're focusing on stylistic choices and technical errors. Now, this is just an example of how you might approach a multi-stage revision process. This is not the one and only way to do it. You need to figure out what works for you. You might look at one thing at a time. You might structure this differently. Maybe you focus on characterization first because that is a weak spot in your work. It really depends on what you need and what your book needs. Also, I will note, there is not a perfect divide between revising tasks and editing tasks. Like many things in writing, there's just no clear-cut, black and white answer here. For example, world building comes out in descriptions. By editing your descriptions, you might be changing your world building and vice versa. So again, it's not neat and tidy. Don't get hung up on, oh, I can't touch that description because I'm just focused on revision. That's not how it works. It's not. No one's going to come after you for mixing the two. What I want you to think about is, have you figured out the high-level things first? Is every scene accomplishing a purpose? Is every character meant to be in your story? Once you've answered those big questions, you can start moving on to the smaller things, the polishing things. All right, let's talk about the specific strategies that you can use when you're tackling those revisions, also known as developmental edits. Strategy number 1, the reverse outline. Basically, a reverse outline is an outline you create after you write your book. The purpose is to give you clarity on your manuscript by identifying exactly what you put on the page when you wrote your first draft. More importantly, it provides you a manageable way to plan out revisions before you start rewriting your story. I love this strategy for pantsers and anyone who ends up with a messy first draft, because it doesn't require you to sit down and read the whole thing as if it is a clean, cohesive manuscript, because most likely your first draft is not. To create a reverse outline, all you're going to do is skim through your manuscript, jot down exactly what happens in each scene or chapter, and try to make note of what that event means to your characters and their development. Once you've created that outline, you're now going to do your revision work on the outline instead of revising directly on your draft. That means you go through, find the scenes that need to be changed, find the places where you have a plot hole and you need to add a scene. You can also make notes about plot elements that you need to bring forward, maybe with a little bit of foreshadowing at an earlier part in the story. The point is, you're going to make those changes in the outline. You can mark them with a different color or different font, whatever makes it easiest for you. Then, that outline basically becomes your checklist of what you need to change when you actually start rewriting your manuscript. That brings me to strategy number 2. Rewrite your manuscript. What do I mean by that? I mean, retype the entire draft without copying and pasting from the old one. I know, that might be controversial, don't blame me. I got this strategy from Matt Bell in his book, Refuse to be Done. It's a great guide to the entire writing process with exercises that take you from drafting all the way to creating your final polished draft. At first, I was skeptical, but I found that retyping forces you to rethink every single sentence in your manuscript to make sure that it actually serves the ultimate vision. Instead of just copy-pasting a scene that kind of worked, you're actually rethinking and rewriting a better version of your book. I recommend pairing this strategy with the reverse outline. Create a reverse outline first, then write from beginning to end, using your reverse outline as a guide to what you're changing and adding along the way. I also find it helpful to use a split screen or dual monitor setup so that you can see your old draft, and if there's a part that you mostly want to leave the same, you can retype it from that old draft. Again, the purpose of retyping is that you're really interrogating, is this worth retyping exactly the way I had it before, or is there a change that needs to be made? Another benefit of this strategy is that it allows you to start the line editing process a little early, because just by nature of retyping your draft, you're going to end up strengthening your descriptions, you're going to end up rethinking some of the things that you wrote before, just because you're deciding on a case-by-case basis how to make your story stronger. Strategy number 3, print or export your manuscript and read it. The goal here is to read your draft as if it's a completed book without editing as you go. And that's the key here, without editing. This may sound really basic, but so many writers get caught in the weeds of revising individual scenes or individual chapters that they forget to pause and actually figure out what their story is going to feel like for a reader. So your goal is to just experience the entire story from beginning to end the way that your readers are going to when your book is published. The how-to? Either print out your manuscript if it's short enough or if you have the budget for all of that ink, or export it as a PDF and send it to your e-reader or Kindle, or just read it in the PDF because you won't be able to edit directly in the document on your computer. As you're reading, try to leave the pens behind. If you have to, you can keep a notepad and list general trends, but you are not doing any inline editing or making changes as you go. Make note, either mentally or on that list, of the parts that are less successful, where you're getting bogged down, bored, maybe the places where the pace is actually too fast or where you've skipped over a really crucial development without giving your characters time to process. Whatever it is, notice it and keep going. At the end, decide what needs to be revised and what you can leave alone. I will note, some writers do this step as soon as they have a first draft. However, I think that can actually be really dangerous if you have a messy first draft. I recommend saving this step for later on in the process. Do a reverse outline first. Rewrite that first draft so you have a second draft that is coherent, cohesive, then sit down and try to experience it as a manuscript or as a full book. If you try to do that too early in the process, it can actually be really detrimental. If you sit down expecting your manuscript to feel like a real book, and it's actually just a complete mess with sentences that go nowhere and scenes that drop off in the middle, that can be really disheartening, and it can actually make it harder to keep up the motivation to continue your revisions. So, you have to know yourself. You have to know how clean your first drafts are, how readable your first drafts are, and decide where in the process this makes sense for you. For me, that's at about draft 2 or 3, because I'm a pantser, that's what works for me. All right, strategies for editing. I know for many of us, editing is revision. We are excited to jump in with a red pen. I also know that for other people, the concept of editing is just bringing back flashbacks of your high school English teacher who totally went to town, marking up your essays in every which way. It's going to be okay. I hope that these strategies take out a little bit of the fear and will hopefully make this process a little bit more accessible. Strategy number 1, and this is vital. You need to find a way to get distance from your work. Our brains are incredible. They're really good at filling in gaps that aren't actually there on the page. You know your story inside out. You know all your characters, you know everything about them. That means that a sentence that is really clear to you and your brain, because you've brought in all these assumptions, might actually not make sense to a reader. Similarly, your brain knows what you meant to write and may completely skip over a typo that is glaringly obvious to anyone else who isn't as familiar with the work. So, we need to find ways to trick our brains a little bit so that we can get around these automatic shortcuts and assumptions and force our brains to see our writing as if they're approaching something new and different. Here are a couple ways to do that. First, just try to edit in a different modality. Print out your draft if you can. Change the look of the program, so maybe change the background in Word. Anything to make your manuscript look a little bit different to your brain. Similarly, you can change the font or text color in your document. You could change the physical space in which you're working. If your brain is really used to writing in one particular location, try a different room, try going to a coffee shop for a day, see what works for you. Another great strategy is to take a break from the project before you start editing, and that actually works in the developmental phase too. But taking some time can help you come back to a project with fresh eyes. You've probably had the experience of writing something, sending it out into the world, maybe it's just a work email, and then for some reason you look back a couple days later and realize there's a typo in the first sentence. That space, taking a break, forces your brain to reacquaint itself with the project, and that can help you see mistakes that you would have otherwise missed. Strategy number 2, identify your personal crutch words or phrases. This is basically creating a list of words that you tend to overuse in your writing. Overused words can become repetitive and distracting to your readers, especially over the course of an entire novel. And reusing the same words over and over again can also make your work seem less professional to readers. Creating a dedicated document, I think, is also important because you are unique. You're not like every other writer on the internet, so finding a list of commonly overused phrases is a great start, but you also want to pay attention to your own quirks and those little phrases that you tend to lean on all the time. For me, it's nodding. My characters nod at everything. Knowing that lets you fix it. How you can do this? Create a document on your computer that you are going to keep coming back to over and over again, or if you're a paper pen kind of person, grab a blank notebook, and just as you're reading your work, start noting the phrases that come up over and over again. This could potentially be paired with that strategy of reading your draft cold, but because you don't want to spend time editing at that phase, you might want to stay away from this and save it for another round. You can also look at those lists on the internet. If you see something and you know that you're one of those people overusing it, write it down. Also, as you're creating that list, keep in mind that the less common a word is, the fewer times you can use it before it starts to feel like it's being overused. For example, you can use said over and over and over again in a manuscript, and it just fades into the background. Most readers are not going to be bothered by said, no matter how many times you use it. In contrast, if your characters are expostulating, you might only get to use that word 1 or 2 times before it starts jumping out at readers and feeling really, really awkward. So, this list is subjective. It's both subjective in that it is personal to you, but it's also subjective in that different words are going to feel overused sooner for different readers. You want to find the happy medium. You might not be able to please everyone, but just be aware that the more uncommon a word is, the stronger its presence. Once you have that list, you can use Control F to find them in your manuscript and limit your usage. The goal is not to eliminate every single one of these words. You want to leave in the ones that are strongest, the ones that are best serving your story, and then if there are ones that you can revise to use a different word that's stronger in that moment, do that. So again, it's never about removing your voice completely from your manuscript. There's a reason you love that word, that you use it all the time. You can still use it. You just want to be conscious of how often and make sure that it's not becoming overwhelming or distracting to your readers. Strategy number 3, use AI. I know that using AI to write your books is really controversial. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about AI grammar tools like ProWritingAid, Grammarly, Hemingway Editor, tools that you're using just to assess and make your writing better. The reason you use these tools is because manually searching for all of the different things we're looking for, overused words, spelling mistakes, adverbs, passive voice, that can get really tedious really quickly. Plus, you're not guaranteed to find all mistakes on your own. It's really hard to do that. I would almost say impossible. AI tools can fill that gap and let you do more of the editing work on your own without having to outsource and pay for help. Choose your tool, download the app, use the browser version, whatever works for you. Then run your manuscript. Most likely you're going to need to run your manuscript in chunks. If you're writing a novel, most of these tools slow down at around 10,000 words. So you're going to have to do this in pieces. that's okay. Run the software. The key is to assess every single recommended change. These tools are great. They can do a lot, but they are imperfect. They cannot replace the knowledge and context that a real human brings to the process. So you need to use your skills as a writer to assess their recommended changes, and this is not really a replacement for a professional copy editor or proofreader. It is just a tool in our arsenal that we can use along the way. Strategy number 4 is my absolute favorite. Hear your story out loud. I love text-to-speech software. If you have a really kind person in your life who is willing to read your story to you, that could also work, but the computer's a little bit more reliable and isn't going to get tired or demand that you pay them in coffee. So I recommend using the text-to-speech built into your computer. Most have them. It's either going to be under review or under the accessibility settings. You might have to play around a little bit to find it, but basically, the computer is going to read your work out loud to you. The benefit is that the computer is going to read exactly what is on the page. Like I said, our brains are really good at making substitutions and assumptions and telling us what we think we wrote, not what we actually wrote. When you hear a mistake, all you need to do is pause the text-to-speech, make a change, then re-listen to that section to ensure the edit works before you move on and keep listening until you reach the end. I will say, this strategy takes a long time, but I think it is so worth it because hearing your work aloud is the best way to catch those mistakes or awkward phrasings. It's also a great way to assess the rhythm, the flow, because if your story sounds good when an awkward robot voice is reading it, most likely it sounds good when an actual human is reading it too. So it's a great way to really hear what your story sounds like and feels like without your brain subbing in the things that you only thought you wrote instead of what you actually wrote. All right, getting feedback, one of the scariest but most essential parts of the writing process. I'm sorry, if you think that you could do this all on your own, it's just not possible. Every writer needs feedback. That is just the reality of this work that we're doing. Think about it. We are taking complex images, ideas, thoughts, dreams out of our heads. Then we're putting them on the page in the form of little squiggles that have come to mean something over hundreds of years. Then we are expecting someone else to read those little squiggles and get those same mental images that we started with. That is an incredibly complex and difficult task, and really the only way to assess whether you've done that effectively is to have another human read your work and let you know what your little squiggles turned into in their brain. So, there are many different ways to get feedback. You need to choose at least one of them at some point in your writing process. Again, it comes back to our brains and the way that they are designed to fill in the blanks and recognize patterns. And basically, it's just that our brains are too good at knowing what we meant to say, and they can't catch those gaps in our logic. They can't help us see that major flaw where we skipped over an important plot development and just assumed people would catch up. We can't always figure that out for ourselves because that's just not how our brains are designed. So getting feedback fills in that gap for us. Just like there are different strategies for different parts of the revision and editing process, there are different types of feedback that are going to work at different points. When you're in the revision phase, this is not the time to consult your grammar warrior friend because you're not there yet. Instead, focus on getting help from a developmental editor or a book coach. You can turn to critique partners, writing groups, beta readers, but anytime you're getting feedback from someone who is not professionally trained, it's really important to give them clear instructions on the type of feedback you want. At this developmental phase, it is essential that you tell that person it is a work in progress, that it might be rough, and that you're only looking for feedback on the story as a whole. If you get feedback from someone who really can't separate out the style from the content of the story, they're probably not the best person to consult at this phase. When you're in the editing phase, you can still get help from critique partners, writing groups, beta readers, but just like you need to be clear about when you're not looking for editing feedback, you need to be clear that you're no longer looking to change your story. If you're only looking for beta readers or critique partners to help you find typos or places where your line level writing is unclear, make sure they know that and that they can put the story aside and just focus on your writing. Of course, you could have people give you feedback on both, but you need to check in and think about whether you're really ready to make changes to both aspects when you get that feedback. If you've already polished up a story on your own, you've already gone through line editing on your own, it might not be the right time to accept feedback on the story if you're not actually willing to go in and make significant changes. So again, anytime you're working with someone who's not professionally trained, make sure you're communicating clearly what you need and want from that experience. The editing phase is also the time to work with line editors and copy editors if that is part of your process. You'll note, I did not mention proofreading at any part of this presentation. That's because proofreading is the final stage in the process and should only happen when your book is formatted and ready for publication. If you are self-publishing, you definitely need to find someone else to proofread for you. Everything that I've already said about your brain skipping over mistakes goes double at the proofreading stage, so it is vitally important to have someone else do that for you. If you are seeking a traditional publishing deal, you don't need to worry about proofreading at all because that will be handled by the publisher as part of the publication process. I know that a lot of writers want to hire a professional. They know that that's an important part of the process, but it can be really expensive. So I just want to touch on a couple of things that you can do to reduce your costs. First, make sure you revise your book before seeking help. It sounds simple, but a lot of people skip this step and end up paying someone to tell them things that they could have recognized on their own. So make sure, if you are trying to be economical, that you revise on your own. Read the craft books. Do the work yourself so that you can have your manuscript in good shape and maybe only need one round of editing. Revising your book on your own can also help you by allowing you to utilize lower cost services that provide less feedback and require more of your own work to make them worthwhile. For example, I offer a service in which I critique outlines. That's a great way to get feedback on your entire plot without having the entire cost of a developmental edit. Of course, you're going to do a lot more work making sure that you implement that feedback and making sure that that feedback can then apply to the entire novel, but it's a great way to get feedback that's more affordable and still covers the entire plot of your story. Similarly, a manuscript evaluation typically gives you a high-level overview of your story, but doesn't give you the inline comments of a developmental edit. So if you are willing to do the work of taking that editorial letter and then figuring out how to apply it at the scene level, that's a great way to save money if you're willing and able to do a little bit more of that work on your own. Of course, that's going to require a bit more craft knowledge, but it's a great way to make the entire writing and publishing process more affordable because, let's be real, editing gets expensive. I'm an editor and I will admit that. Another strategy is to start saving up as you write your draft. Especially if you're planning to self-publish, there are going to be costs associated with that process. If you want to actually invest in starting a career, you need to think of it as a business. There are costs anytime you start a business. That's the reality. So think about saving up so that you're ready when you get to that stage. I also recommend expanding your editor search. Editors charge very different prices for similar services. There's no central organization organizing us all. So make sure you seek out multiple sample edits and try to find the editor that balances effective cost with really effective feedback by expanding your search, making sure you really do your research to find someone who is both skilled and affordable for you. All right, we have made it to the end of this presentation. I know I have hit you with a lot of information, a lot of strategies. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or worried or like you don't know where to start, go back to that vision you had of the reader who needs your book, the one who's going to fall in love with your characters and your story, and do not give up. Revision is hard work. Editing is hard work. But you can totally do this. Thank you so much for joining in for this presentation. If you have any questions, if you want me to explain or clarify anything that you saw in this presentation, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. My email is olivia@oliviahelpswriters.com. And of course, if you are looking for an editor, I would also love to help you. I offer developmental editing, manuscript evaluations, and plot critiques, and I would love to help you make your book the best it can be. And last thing, do not forget to check out the resource list. It's at oliviahelpswriters.com/WWC-resources. This is a password-protected page. The password revise, all caps, will get you in and get you access to all those great resources that I put together for you. All right, thank you again for listening to this presentation. Happy writing and have a great day.